Friends, thank you very much for staying on for our book launch. It is terrific to look out and see so many warm and friendly faces and people who've travelled far and wide to be with us this afternoon, so thank you very much. The way we would like the proceedings to go is that I will briefly introduce Professor John Nyland, who will then say a few words, and then he will then ask Mr Howard to speak. This is actually about the chapter contributors this afternoon, and what we would like when Mr Howard has finished speaking is to stay on stage. We'll call up the contributors, who will then come up the stairs on this side. Trish will hand them a copy of the book. There'll be a handshake, but not that handshake. And you'll have your photo taken. They will be available free of charge, as the parliamentary service is offered today. We will do the same. So, ladies and gentlemen, if I can introduce Professor John Nyland. John is an academic and board director. He obtained a Bachelor and Master of Commerce from UNSW and his PhD from the University of Illinois. He has held academic positions at Cornell University, the Australian National University, as we call it, the other place, and UNSW. He served as a mediator of labour disputes in the US while at Cornell, and in Australia has undertaken extensive academic and policy work in conflict resolution, theory and practice, particularly enterprise bargaining. John is a Professor Emeritus of UNSW and was our fourth Vice-Chancellor and President between 1992 to 2002. The University of New South Wales' most recognised and architecturally renowned building, the Scientia building, was officially renamed the John Nyland Scientia building for his long and distinguished history at the university. Leading the university through a golden age, which included significant internationalisation and campus revitalisation, he received the President's Prize of the Royal Australian Institute of Architects for the UNSW campus redevelopment in 2007. John was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for services to industrial relations and reform in 1992, and in 2001 became a Companion of the Order of Australia, Australia's highest civilian honour for services to education. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor John Nyland.
Well, thank you very much for those most generous words. I'll move the water away from my right arm, which tends to move like this and on occasions like this. It's a delight to be here, particularly once again within the orbit, the ambit, the halo of UNSW Canberra. As Vice-Chancellor, one of my most pleasant occasions was to be down here, either for the graduations or the passing appraisals, I think they were called then, I'm not sure what the term is now. But arrangements such as we have between UNSW and ADFA, I believe, are terribly important for the country, and it's great to see it doing so well. And I should also congratulate Tom Frame for what he's been able to put together in these series that we're now working our way through. It's quite an extraordinary achievement, but then he did have a reasonable body of work to go along with, but more of that later. This evening we are now 3 books into a 4-book series, which in sum will cover the 4 terms of government led by John Howard. It's my honour today to launch Book 3, Trials and Transformations, or Tribulations, as some of you would have it. The period under review is from August 2001, several months before the 2001 election of the third Howard government, through to September 2004. While my period of focus starts with the momentous events of 2001, I take this opportunity to digress for a moment. I want to salute John Howard's leadership following the Port Arthur massacre just 5 months into his first term. The gun control measures that followed stand to his everlasting credit. If only others had followed the same, if only if they would. Congratulations and thank you, sir. In political terms, some years just limp along, probably most of them, but a few are truly transformational. This puts me in mind of a favourite book. Gerald Stone's volume titled 1932, One Hell of a Year. The highlights of that year were the Great Depression, the birth of the ABC, Tilly Devine and her nighttime business activities, Jack Lang, Joe Lyons and the London banks, the New Guard, de Groot and the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, or rather the two openings of the bridge, and much more. And so, with the third Howard book being launched this afternoon, we come to what I believe is another one hell of a year, 2001, the year of transition between the second and third Howard governments and the context of a quite remarkable election outcome. I see the seminal elements of 2001 as these. There was the centenary of Federation. There were corporate collapses of an unprecedented nature, HIH and Ansett, which was referred to earlier, Tampa, the arrival of civs, children overboard, deployment of Australian troops into Afghanistan with the US and all that followed from that, the death of Sir Donald Bradman perhaps should be mentioned, and of course the tragedy of 9/11 and all that followed from that. One defining element of a seminal year is the event where all of us remember where we were when the news came through, and 2001 certainly qualifies for obvious reasons. Politics being politics, there's no shortage of critical, even caustic assessment of the third Howard government, and we've seen and heard some of that today. 3 books published between 2001 and 2004 feature a group of what I think of as the true disbelievers. There's Guy Rundle, for example, who saw John Howard as the true opportunist and the most reactionary PM we've ever had. Margot Kingston's book lays bare the insidious way in which John Howard's government, I'm quoting, Howard's government was profoundly undermined our freedom and our rights, while Robert Mann argues that John Howard is the most conservative leader the Liberal Party has ever had and has remade and divided the nation. Of these true disbelievers, Tom Frame has taken particular aim at Robert Mann, who, he says, has engaged in little more than special pleading, denying the possibility of contrary views. There were no discordant voices in Mann's collection. Either they couldn't be found or they regarded their views as unworthy of inclusion in a collection bearing his name. No such charge could ever be laid against this third volume of the Howard years, or its predecessor volumes for that matter. There have been on display points of view and conclusions from many parts of the spectrum. Little wonder, I suppose, when the guidelines issued by Tom invite all presenters to nominate 3 failures or frailties among whatever else they might come through with. And we are to engage, we're reminded, not in a celebration, but in a critical appraisal. And this indeed is one of the true strengths of the Howard Government Retrospective Conference series and the books that followed. I'm inclined to wonder how this would all travel if presented on some modern university campuses. But I better not go there tonight. Happily, we're here at the National Press Club, where countervailing arguments are always welcome, even though they may offend in some particular way on some occasion. Contributors to the third volume have a rich canvas with which to work. They've got the seminal year factor, the 2001 election. They've got Tampa, the children overboard, all in the shadow of 9/11. They've got immigration policy and public opinion. They've got trade, environment, economic growth, national identity, the culture wars, so much more. I might just observe, given my own particular background, that the volume struck me as something of an industrial relations-free zone. Industrial relations occurred as a prominent touch point in the first Howard government, in the second Howard government, and, as we've heard tonight, in the fourth Howard government. It strikes me that perhaps what was going on is, with the changes that were ushered in by the Greiner-Fay government in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and then picked up by Keating and Hawke, we had enterprise bargaining coming through, having been researched and processed through a green paper methodology where many people had an opportunity to express their point of view. And then the seminal decade leading into 2001, where the enterprise bargaining system settled in. We moved away from a centralised tribunal-led court system. We moved away from comparative wage justice, all those things. We had, in effect, a type of policy equivalent of the quiet Australian just sitting there in the year from 1990 to 2000, ready for work choices to come along and perhaps pick up that wind. Maybe we can come back to that thought later on, or maybe in the fourth volume. But there's much more than this, and partly because the volume I'm talking about, the third volume, which we see today, has 100 pages more than either of the other two. So that's another measure of just how much material there was to work with. The seminal year effect of 2001 played strongly on voting intentions and outcomes. As Murray Goot notes, in the first few months of 2001, the government appeared in terminal trouble. One pollster measured coalition support at an all-time low, but then, Phoenix-like, the coalition rose to retain government by year's end. Paul Kelly has argued that this was a virtually unprecedented turnaround. That surely says something about John Howard's leadership. The intervening events, Tampa, Children Overboard, 9/11 and the Afghan incursions, all were treated in depth. About half of the book, in fact, is devoted to the events that either occurred in that seminal year or arose directly from it. There are two broad strands to that coverage. First, there are the views and experiences of serving uniformed personnel. Deek, Smith, Morrison, they all craft fascinating views from inside Tampa and Children Overboard. Bob Morrison reminds us that it was all an unscripted challenge, done with professionalism, integrity, determination, and compassion. The second strand goes to the political impact of whether 1, 2, or 3 of these events were needed to get the Prime Minister into a third term of government. Whatever the mix, and quoting Tom Frame, John Howard was transformed in the electorate's eyes from a tired and out-of-touch mediocrity to a man of principle defending the national interest. The harshest words, of course, come through from those true disbelievers. Mungo McCallum, Alan Ramsey, I won't quote them in polite company. From Virginia Trioli, one of the most shameful and deeply divisive periods of our political history. That's been one of the characteristics of this series. No holes are barred. The celebration is there, but so too is the critique. Importantly, as Tom Frame notes, John Howard steadfastly maintains he had no knowledge that the initial report was false until after the election. And as Tom reminds us, nothing more can usefully be said about the facts relating to the Children Overboard affair until official records are released in 2021. Another set of chapters deals with trade, environment and economics. But my time here is running short, so I select just 3 quotes that each highlight interesting thought lines. One dealing with nostalgia, another choosing between friends, and another dealing with intergenerational effects. In Ainsley Kello's words, we can look back on the third Howard government with a degree of nostalgia for the lack of excitement and its steady management of environment and economy. The contrast with what has come since is stark. To Mark Vaile, the Howard government's approach to trade liberalisation and microeconomic reform has unquestionably made a major contribution to our entire generation of young Australians, all of whom have perhaps taken national prosperity for granted. And from Mark Vaile again, the conduct of Australian trade through this period refuted the myth that we had to choose between China and the United States, or to choose between our cultural and historical links with Europe and the United States. Well, there's an issue that lives on, if ever there was one. Perhaps under the heading of famous last words, we have this from Mr. Howard in 2003. Gone are the days when a single market, the United Kingdom, accounted for 1/3 of our total exports. Now no single country accounts for more than 20% of Australia's exports. Well, now, 15 years later, China is up where the UK once was, followed by Japan and South Korea. Several authors also touch on the issue of national identity brought to the fore by the events of 2001 and the subsequent political dynamic. John Howard is himself a key player, and Kim Murray captures that well. On national identity, he did not waver. In his words, "Love me or loathe me, the Australian people know where I stand and what I believe in." That and luck, conviction, and consistent determination to push through his policies marked his leadership and relationship with the Australian people. And it's also important to recognise, in the words of Darren Ages, that with the third Howard government, the number of women being promoted to the ministry and the number of women in government was higher than in any other administration in Australian political history to that point. Well, I now come to the conclusion, and I'm inclined to think I'll go this way. If I were to pick a favourite observation from this highly engaging volume from this third book, it would be hard to go beyond the observation of Frank Bongiorno. I paraphrase his observation, and it entails Mark Latham. For some, John Howard's greatest service to his nation was something the Labor Party could simply not achieve. That was to save the country from a Latham Prime Ministership. Thank you for allowing me that wry observation. And on that, I now move to commend to you highly Trials and Tribulations, and I launched the book figuratively, and there are books all around, and I think Tom's going to take care of the distribution. So thank you very much, and John Howard, congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Nyland, for your very gracious comments. It's very appropriate that you are here today and to launch this volume, because much of today's discussion has focused on industrial relations. And I can recall very vividly during some of our wilderness years in Australian politics, when we were the opposition and Mr Hawke was the Prime Minister, and the Liberal Party was going through a bit of an internal debate on industrial relations. And those of us who were arguing, as Sean Carney recalled, for the deregulation of the labour market, were attracted to the contributions of a number of people in the academic world, and principal amongst those was your good self, Professor Dick Blaney from the Institute of Labour Studies, I think it was called, in South Australia. You two stood out as people who were arguing in favour of the deregulation of the labour market. It was a long, at times argumentative and acrimonious debate, but it was a very necessary debate to alter the attitude of the Liberal Party, and in its train also the National Party, on the issue of industrial relations. Because what is often forgotten, if I can be forgiven a diversion on industrial relations, and I'm always tempted by diversions on industrial relations, what has to be remembered is that until then, the mindset of both political parties, including the coalition, was very much in favour of the old industrial relations order. I can remember the great founder of the Liberal Party, somebody who I admire immensely, Robert Menzies, saying, after he'd left the Prime Ministership, in a series of lectures he gave in the United States, saying how much he revered the Industrial Relations Commission, or the Commonwealth Conciliation Commission, as it was then called. Well, it was called a court until the middle 50s with the engineers case the Boilermakers case.
1956.
1956, that's right. It was the year I left school. And what he said was that the industrial relations system in Australia was terrific, and that the judges of that Conciliation Commission were gifted men, and they were all men at that time, and they made very wise decisions. And we were sensible enough not to allow such things as wages and conditions of work to become the subject of debate at election time. So that was the measure of the commitment. Much and all as I admired that man, his views on industrial relations carried forward into the majority of the members of the Fraser government, and it was not an easy task. The world had changed and we needed to change our policy. But you, sir, were seen, to those of us in growing numbers who wanted to change, you were seen as somebody who was articulating many of the ideas with which we're associated. So I thank you very warmly for that contribution and join others in saluting your remarkable contribution to education in Australia. Can I say that the events covered by this volume were very momentous. You likened it to 1932, and I thought your roll call of events in 1932 was very good, although I don't recall you mentioning Stan McCabe's 187 at the beginning of the Bodyline series against Larwood and Bose, but I'll forgive you for that small indiscretion. But 2001 was one of those one of those pivotal years. And I suppose for somebody of my generation, you say, where were you when John Kennedy was assassinated? Where were you when Gough Whitlam was dismissed? I was actually just in Parliament, and it was fairly dramatic. And as was Philip Ruddock, I think he's the only other person in this room who was a Member of Parliament in 1975. And of course, where were you on the 11th September 2001? And it was quite an extraordinary time, and it's not the place to go into the details of the response. But this volume covers the period of the aftermath of the introduction of the GST, and it is true that the government's fortune sagged very, very badly in the early part of 2001. We lost the Ryan by-election on St Patrick's Day. I'm not blaming the Irish for it. On St Patrick's Day in 2001, but through a process of changes and responses, particularly the alteration in the fuel excise, because fundamentally Australians got suspicious in the early part of 2001 that we'd fiddled them with the GST, and we hadn't cut excise enough because we had an increase in the price of petrol, and the Australian hip pocket nerve always reacts very badly to an increase in the price of petrol. But we clambered our way back, and I thought Murray Goot's analysis of the 2004 election was fascinating, and it put me in mind of the most encouraging day I had in the lead-up to the 2001 election, and that was the day of the Rugby League Grand Final. Now, in those days, it was the practice. Rugby League always asked the Prime Minister of the day to present the trophy. Bob Hawke had done it, and I was very happy to continue the tradition. It seems to have sort of altered a bit in recent years. And Rugby League, of course, the demographic of Rugby League, I think, probably divides about 60% Labor, 40% Coalition. It probably was more of a Labor game years earlier, perhaps a bit less so now. Now, I'd presented the trophy in 96 and 7 and 8 and run through the years, and I'd got more boos than cheers, and that's part of the blood sport. I mean, the worst one was when I had to present as a St George follower the 99 trophy to Glenn Lazarus for the Melbourne Storm, but that's another story. And I went out in 2001 to present the trophy, And I wasn't cheered, but I wasn't booed. And I thought, this is a very interesting focus group. I was encouraged by that, and remarked on it to a few people, including my wife afterwards, and as it turned out, it was propitious. But I've got to thank you very warmly, and I want to thank all of those who've contributed to the last retrospective and also today. I found today's absolutely stimulating. There's so much more I could say about today, but I'll confine that to my father and make a see Tom's nodding with approval. I'm not going to launch into that now, but can I just say this to Tom and to Andrew and those who run the library and the leadership group. It's a wonderful exercise, and I think today and earlier days have been wonderful exercises in the battle of ideas, because, and I welcome the fact that Michael Danby has followed the tradition of there being somebody from the Labor Party taking part in these conferences, because it is a contest of ideas, and respectable, mature, emphatic difference of opinion in debate is fundamental to the Australian political system. And it was somebody, maybe it was our current Prime Minister, who said we shouldn't stop disagreeing, we just have to start disagreeing a little more respectfully. And it is unfortunately a feature of political debate, not only here, but I mean, we're seeing it in the United States, fuelled by the impeachment proceedings, that it has become increasingly less civil. Now, maybe it was always like that. Maybe Scott Prass is absolutely right and suggesting that, but one does sense that we could do with more of the sort of exchanges that we've had today across the party divide. But thank you, Professor, for your very kind remarks, and I thank all of the contributors to the volume that we're presiding over, and also for your contributions today. And to you, Tom, and to Andrew, thank you very much for the wonderful work you do in running this library. Thanks a lot.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my warm duty to introduce our chapter contributors. Just remind you to come up to this side, and Trish will pass the copy of the book. And then, yes, Michael, you right? Good angle. So part 1, the Tampa controversy. Chapter 4, a uniformed legal perspective, Michael Smith.
Thank you very much. Lovely to see you. Good to see you. Here we go. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Chapter 5, a commander's perspective, Bob Morrison. Part 2, the 2001 election and its aftermath, known internally as the Goot volume. It's quite a heavy book. Chapter 6, turning around the votes, the 2001 election, Murray Goot. Chapter 9, the conduct of public inquiries, and Appendix 2, public inquiries appointed by the Howard government, Scott Prasser. Chapter 10, the Latham factor, Frank Bongiorno.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I won't give you a life insurance.
No.
Thank you.
Part 3, Interacting with a Changing World. Chapter 11, Immigration and Public Opinion. Mr Mayor, Philip Ruddick. Part 4, Conflict and Controversy. Chapter 13, Afghanistan, A War Without End, William Maley. Chapter 14, Iraq and the Politics of Alliance Relationships, Our Palazzo.
Thank you.
Part 5, The Polemics of the Past. Chapter 15, The History Wars, Zahra Gazarian. Chapter 16, National Identity as a Political Tool, Kim Murray. Part 7, Closing Reflections, Chapter 20, You Knew What He Stood For, Fiona Wade. Chapter 21, The View from Kirribilli, John Howard. Returning to Chapter 2, The Editorial View, Andrew Blythe.
That's mine, yes, thank you.
No. Chapter 1, Setting the Scene. Chapter 22, Postscript, Appraisals and Assessments. And Editor, Tom Frame. I now ask Professor Frame to say a few words.
It's very encouraging to have you all here, particularly those who have been with us throughout the day. This is the largest of the 3 volumes to date. It contains much that's controversial, but in many ways it's not that complex as the Howard government went about its work. I'm most grateful to John Nyland for launching the book and for prompting me, pushing me, to write the Children Overboard chapter, which he thought would be a notable omission from this volume if it were not there. As Mr Howard has said, John Nyland is a visionary Vice-Chancellor of our university. It's the university that I think is, for me, an intellectual home. There are about 4 people in the world who, when they speak authoritatively. I always feel obliged to listen, and 2 of them are to my right. So it's a great joy for me to have John Nyland here, and a great encouragement to say him say such positive words about this shared endeavour. I naturally continue to thank Mr Howard, who, when it came to something like children overboard, he and I had our most vigorous discussion that we've ever had on the matter. And when he puts a view, he doesn't put a view with the insistence that it be accepted, that it be treated on its merits. And for all of the things that people might say about the Howard Library or about this series, not once, not ever, has he attempted to push us in a particular direction for reasons other than we believe the evidence would lead us. So for all the things I hear about the Howard government constraining debate, about pushing people in certain directions or dismissing certain views, that has never been my experience with John Howard, and I've known him now for 18 years. I want to thank all of the contributors. I have learnt by reading their work at least 3 or 4 times. I've learnt things that I did not know, and so being the editor, I'm greatly enriched by their insight. And I have to say, in respect of my friend Murray Goot, and the chapter is the longest probably we will ever have, if you're going to write about the 2001 election and you want the best coverage of that election and it costs you 12,000 words, well, I'm ready to pay the price. We have, I believe, without doubt, the description of that election that will stand with time. And so, although I groaned when I said 5,000 and this thing came in the email that was 12,800, you know with Murray it's all quality. That was true for all of the other contributors as well. And I'm grateful to them for taking the trouble to engage with the philosophy of this series, which is critical engagement. I thank, of course, my own Howard Library colleagues. They don't seem to get bored of the fact that I can turn any lunchtime discussion round to what happened between 1996 and 2007. They're great people to be with. I acknowledge the role of Paul O'Byrne and Elspeth Menzies at Unsw Press, which is an adornment to our university, greatly supported by Professor Nyland. The University of WA has just apparently lost or made a decision to lose its press. I cannot fathom why a university would do that. Our press, what it does, the prestige it brings to our university and the opportunity for the contest of ideas makes me a proud UNSW Press contributor. I mentioned too Jocelyn Hungerford, who, if some of the contributors thought I changed their words, you ought to see what she did to mine. And I also thank Glenda Brown, who did the index. Indexing and root canal therapy would seem to me among equal levels of pleasure, but Glenda did well. I continue to thank our friends at AusPic for the support that they give, but finally I thank my own family who make it easy for me to be me. So my wife Helen, who is here, my 2 daughters Kelly and Megan, who I don't know whether they humour my discussion of politics, but they always give another generational view that I'm always happy to have. And when I think about the work that I do and the kind of society the Howard government try to create, the principal beneficiaries are, not will be, are my lovely granddaughters Lily, who's just here, and Imogen, who's across the way. I believe they will benefit, they are benefiting from the things that happened between 1996 and 2007. Our parliamentary democracy and our regard for education, those things I think make all of this worthwhile. And although I can't imagine that Lily and Imi will want to pick up Volume 3 and dip into it, although Granddad's chapter's pretty interesting, in time I hope they'll read about the things that their granddad and many other important people felt was worthy in the world. This is the largest single publishing undertaking of my professional life, and I've never once felt, why am I doing this? This isn't worthy. It is worthy of the time, it's worthy of the intensity of thought, it's worthy of fixing up all of the footnotes that somehow every year I say, do them like this, and people do them their own hybrid style. I think it doesn't matter, because this really is worth it. There is still, can I say, and the other day I was waving around 3 volumes and someone said, well, you know something about the Howard government, do you? It's still a case that a fraction of what the Howard government did is contained in the covers of these books. There is so much scholarship, so many questions, so many contentious interpretations of those years that I think are still deserving of people's attention. Yes, it did some good things. Yes, it did some not good things. But it's actually the things about which we have no knowledge. The good policy reforms, and even working out how it was that John Howard could keep his team together for 11 years, 8 months and 23 days, a task which has, eluded his successors. If he made it look easy, it wasn't because it was easy, is because there were certain skills, and if we want to learn about leadership, we then should look to leaders. And so today is a happy day for my team, for our university, and I hope for political studies in Australia. I look at my colleagues in this work and we might think that this is a hard time for political studies, but it isn't, from the point of view that we've got such great people doing wonderful things. Frank Murray, others around, Zare, Nick, Maria. There's lots of good work that can be done, and even Joshua, who's devoting his PhD to Australian political studies. If we think our system or our way of doing politics is not all it could be, then, well, let's start with good scholarship, and I'm surrounded by great colleagues. I'm grateful for that. So, my friends, thank you for all being with us. I do hope that you read the book, and if there are certain bits of feedback you'd like to share with me, it'll always make for a better volume 4. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tom. Ladies and gentlemen, one of my last tasks is to read a message from Kathy Bale, CEO of Unsw Press. I'm sorry I cannot be with you at the National Press Club for the launch of Trials and Transformations. The conferences and events for the previous 2 volumes were a great success, and I have no doubt there will be a keen readership for the 3rd volume. This 4-volume series is a significant publishing project for Unsw Press. Our university press is structured to disseminate scholarship within the academy and to a wider readership by marketing books in print and digital formats. This book is, of course, available in all good bookshops and online. We are also proud to be the publishers of this series because it involves many of our distinguished colleagues at UNSW Canberra, as well as Australia's most astute political scientists and authors. Please pass on my regards and thanks to the contributors celebrating with you for their research and original observations. Former UNSW Vice-Chancellor and Professor Emeritus John Nyland for launching the book, and former Prime Minister John Howard for commending it. And Professor Michael Frater, Rector of UNSW Canberra, for his appreciation of a university press that supports scholarship in Australian military and political history. And thank you, Tom. You are one of the most prolific and committed editors and authors. You are an excellent ambassador for UNSW Press in the tertiary sector, and we appreciate the distinctive book proposals you bring to our publishing team. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Kathy Bale. Well, that concludes our book launch, but I won't hold you up too long. I just wanted to make reference to the image behind. All 3 books are available this evening for $75. You can buy volumes 1, 2 and 3 individually, but I reckon you should go for the 3. Christmas is coming. We do have a table dedicated for that at the back there, and I'm sure, if I can just lean in, Mr Howard, you've got your pen with you? Excellent, there we go. Price is still the same, but they will be signed. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the evening.